Nothing about what just happened to Sheryl Swoopes was sudden, accidental, or surprising to anyone who has been paying attention for longer than a headline cycle. What shocked people wasn't that she disappeared from WNBA broadcasts, it was how quietly, how completely, and how deliberately it happened. No farewell segment. No public statement. No dramatic announcement. Just absence. And in professional sports, silence like that is never random. It's the loudest signal there is. For years, Swoopes positioned herself as an untouchable authority, someone whose legacy as a pioneer shielded her from scrutiny, criticism, or accountability. But legacy only protects you when your present behavior doesn't actively undermine the future of the sport. The moment her commentary stopped sounding like analysis and started feeling like obsession, the countdown began. This wasn't about disagreement. This wasn't about generational tension. This was about credibility collapsing in real time while millions were watching. And when the league finally moved, it didn't move emotionally, it moved strategically. What most fans are only now realizing is that this wasn't a one-off incident tied to Caitlin Clark. Clark was simply the moment where the pattern became impossible to ignore. Long before the WNBA, long before podcasts and viral clips, Sheryl Swoopes had already shown the same behavioral red flags in positions of power, emotional volatility, blurred boundaries, and an inability to separate personal frustration from professional responsibility. When those traits existed in private environments, they were managed quietly. When they appeared on national platforms, they became a liability. The difference wasn't her behavior. The difference was visibility. And once you put a microphone in front of someone who hasn't learned restraint, the truth always leaks out eventually. The WNBA didn't remove Swoopes because she criticized Caitlin Clark. Criticism is part of the job. They removed her because the criticism stopped being rooted in facts. It became selective, distorted, and repetitive to the point where it distracted from the product on the floor. When an analyst repeatedly misstates basic information about the league's most visible player, age, eligibility, shot volume, historical context, that's not an opinion issue. That's a trust issue. And once viewers stop trusting the analyst, the network stops trusting them too. Broadcasting isn't about who you were. It's about whether audiences believe you now. Swoopes kept forcing a narrative that contradicted easily verifiable reality, and each time she doubled down instead of correcting herself, the credibility gap widened. What made this situation irreversible was how she responded when challenged. When peers corrected her publicly, she didn't recalibrate, she reacted defensively. When respected voices reached out privately, the relationship fractures became permanent. And when fans began noticing that Caitlin Clark's name was being deliberately excluded from discussions where it was impossible to justify her absence, the perception shifted from bias to intent. At that point, the story stopped being about basketball commentary and started being about motive. Once motive is questioned, the analyst loses the benefit of the doubt forever. That's the line you don't cross in media, because once audiences believe you're pushing a personal agenda, every word after that is suspect. The league understood something critical that many didn't. Caitlin Clark isn't just a player, she's an inflection point. She represents new viewers, new money, new relevance, and new scrutiny. You don't need to praise her endlessly, but you cannot afford to undermine her legitimacy with misinformation. Doing so doesn't just hurt Clark, it hurts the league's credibility at a moment when it's finally breaking through. The WNBA has spent decades fighting for mainstream attention, and for the first time, the spotlight isn't fleeting. Protecting that momentum means protecting the integrity of the conversation around it. Analysts who add value stay. Analysts who become distractions get removed. It really is that simple. That's why the response wasn't loud. It was surgical. Sheryl Swoopes wasn't cancelled. She wasn't debated. She wasn't defended. She was quietly replaced. Broadcast teams were announced. Her name wasn't there. Schedules rolled out. She wasn't included. One omission turned into a pattern. A pattern turned into a message. And that message was unmistakable. The league is done sacrificing its future to protect egos from the past. This wasn't revenge. It was risk management. Because when one voice consistently derails the conversation every time the league's biggest star is mentioned, that voice becomes expendable, no matter how legendary the resume looks on paper. And here's the part that makes this moment so uncomfortable for some fans. The WNBA didn't choose sides between Sheryl Swoopes and Caitlin Clark. It chose reality. It chose accuracy. It chose growth. While one analyst was slowly being phased out, others who supported the evolution of the game, who celebrated new stars instead of resenting them, kept their seats. That contrast tells you everything. This wasn't personal. It was directional. The league is moving forward, and anyone standing in front of that momentum instead of contributing to it is going to get run over. Caitlin Clark didn't take. And that's why this moment changes everything. Because it signals that the WNBA is finally willing to protect its future even when that means disappointing parts of its past. It's a warning shot to every voice with a platform. Analysis matters, facts matter, and personal grudges will not be disguised as expertise anymore. The silence around Swoopes isn't an accident, it's a conclusion. And whether people want to admit it or not, this outcome wasn't just predictable. It was inevitable. The most dangerous people in sports media aren't the loud critics or the obvious haters. They're the ones who weaponize credibility while pretending to be objective. Sheryl Swoopes didn't lose her platform because she had an unpopular opinion. She lost it because the pattern behind her commentary became impossible to defend. Once is a mistake. Twice is coincidence. But when misinformation, selective silence, and emotional deflection repeat themselves across years, platforms, and power positions, it stops being accidental. It becomes behavioral. And that's where this story stops being about Caitlin Clark alone and starts exposing something much deeper, a long-standing inability to operate responsibly when authority and ego collide. Long before broadcasting booths and podcast microphones, similar complaints followed Swoopes into leadership roles where young athletes had little power and even less protection. The language used by former players wasn't dramatic, it was consistent. Fear instead of trust. Confusion instead of clarity. Emotional unpredictability replacing structure. These weren't stories about hard coaching or high standards. They were about instability. About environments where players felt they were navigating moods rather than systems. When authority figures blur emotional boundaries, they don't just disrupt performance, they erode confidence. And once confidence is replaced by survival mode, development dies. That history matters, not because it should define someone forever, but because unresolved patterns don't disappear, they resurface in new settings. Broadcasting simply gave those tendencies a bigger stage. Instead of closed-door locker rooms, the audience became millions. Instead of private conversations, the damage happened in real time. And instead of vulnerable athletes, the target became the most visible player in women's basketball. Caitlin Clark wasn't just another rookie. She was the symbol of a shifting league, younger, louder, more profitable, and more scrutinized than ever before. That made her the perfect focal point for someone uncomfortable with losing control of the narrative.